combat. It's cool, or at least it can be. It can also be kind of a drag. I see a lot of people online puzzling about how to make combat in 5th edition more interesting or how to make their monsters more dynamic. There's a common complaint that I myself have made that monsters in 5th edition tend to feel kind of samey, like everything's just a big bag of hit points with 1 or 2 special abilities. That fact, combined with the fact that fights in 5th edition tend to be over so quickly, can often leave us feeling unsatisfied. We often don't get to use our monsters in the way that we wanted, and this leaves us with the feeling that our players never really got to see what we thought made those monsters or that combat encounter cool. There are several great articles out there about how to beef up your monsters or reflavor them or give them an extra little bit of punch. I'll try to collect a few in the description below. But we need to think about combat encounters in terms of more than just our monster stat blocks. Now, it's certainly a good place to start, and it's a necessary thing to do to run combats well, and I get why it's a compelling thing to do, to focus on monster stat blocks. For a lot of us DMs who spend a lot of time in prep, it feels like a very concrete, mechanical thing that we can turn our attention to. But there's so much that we can do with our monsters that doesn't have hard, quantifiable, mechanical representations in the game, and there's so much more to a combat than just the monster stat blocks. Because there already exist a lot of resources about altering your monsters, that's not the topic of this video. Instead, I want to focus on something else. In fact, I want to focus on 2 something elses. What makes a combat interesting? And what makes it difficult? And I think to give myself some space to really dig into these topics, I'm going to spread those across 2 videos. So this is the What Makes Combat Interesting video. This broad question of how to generate interest is at the heart of any kind of game design. Of course, I don't have a silver bullet for this. If I did, I would be a very rich and successful game designer, which I'm not. But the great thing about running games of D&D for your friends is you have direct and immediate access to what interests them and what works on them. You should ask them what parts of your game they like and they don't like. You should mine conversations for what they like about other games. You're also free to do whatever you want in a combat because, again, it doesn't have to stand up on its own outside the context of your game and your table and your group. So free yourself. Give yourself permission to try all the things. And some things you try are going to fall on their face. You might have something meticulously planned out, and come time for that combat, for whatever reason, you have to completely abandon it. That's okay. Trial and error really are the best teachers, so long as you are trying to examine your experiences critically and learn from what you're trying, what worked, and what failed. But that's a fairly generic piece of advice. So let's dig down and see if we can't find something more practical and more concrete to use. I tend to get bored as a player when a fight devolves into everyone kind of standing around and doing the same thing turn after turn. I think probably many of us have experienced this. There comes a point in many a 5th edition fight where the combat flattens out and just becomes about trading blows with the enemy until one side is left standing. It's kind of boring. So how do we avoid this? A lot of the advice I see on other channels or from other sources treats this issue as one of descriptive deficiency. The solution on offer then becomes to prompt your players to further engage with those details. The refrain that you hear repeated over and over again is, well, tell me what that looks like. What does the attack look like? Describe how your spell looks. I think this is largely a mistake. The underlying assumption is that the fight has become boring because your players aren't imagining in enough detail what's happening. And if you, the DM, prompt them to flex their imaginations more, to engage more with those details, you'll recapture their interest. Now, if this is working for you, if this is properly spicing up your fight, great, keep doing it. But I think there's probably more that we should be doing. I don't think it is a detail or description problem. I think it's a problem with the fiction within your combat. I think fights get boring because players eventually run out of interesting decisions to make. So let's think about what decisions a player is making in your standard round of combat. In a very literal sense, the decisions your players are making in combat are completely covered by the list of actions they can take in the player's handbook. Attack, cast a spell, dash, dodge, disengage, hide, search, use an object, ready, help? Maybe that's it. It's a comprehensive and flexible enough list that it should be able to cover whatever actions your players want to do in combat. But I think treating this list as representing the decisions your players are making is misleading. I think probably your players are thinking about what they're doing in combat along more immersive, fiction-based lines. Your players don't think, I want to take the attack action against that goblin. They think, I want to attack that goblin. What's happening in the fiction of the game that leads up to a player saying, I disengage and move away? Probably that player is in trouble. Why did she take the disengage action? Because she's trying to retreat. What's happening that leads up to a player taking the dash action? It's often the same thing. The interesting decision that we as DMs should be concerning ourselves with is not what action the player takes, but rather her decision to retreat. Of course, within that decision, the player now is faced with another interesting decision, which action to take, the dash action or the disengage action, as both have their pros and cons. But it's very difficult for us, the DM, to orchestrate decision-making on that level of granularity and also have it feel good for your players. I think it's probably easier and just better and more useful to think about what decisions our players are making on that higher layer of abstraction. So when we're planning out our combats and we're thinking about what we might do to make those fights more interesting or more dynamic, we need to be thinking about how our players might advance into the fight, retreat, or tackle some other larger narrative goal. We need to be thinking about the points in that combat where we foist narrative choices on our players. Let's say we, the players, encounter a trio of ogres in the hills. A fight breaks out and it's initiative. Now I'm playing a fighter, and on my first turn I'm faced with a decision to make. What do I do? Well, I move up and attack one of the ogres, obviously. Was that an interesting decision? No, not really. But you might say, I had another decision to make. I had a choice about which ogre to attack. And yeah, you would be right. I did have a decision about which monster to take the attack action against. But let's return to that higher layer of abstraction. Does choosing to attack Ogre A accomplish a different narrative goal than choosing to attack Ogre B? Or is either of those decisions really just the decision to go on the offensive? If it's the latter, then choosing which ogre to attack is not an interesting decision. It doesn't really matter. You might also argue that I had the option to not fight at all. I could have chosen to talk, retreat, run away, try to make an intimidation check, and yes, all of those things are true, but this is, after all, a video about how to make combat interesting. So if the argument is that within a combat I always have the option to not combat, well, I'm not sure we're having the same discussion anymore. Let's come at this another way. Here's something that I sometimes hear my players say, and when I hear it, I take it as a strong indicator that my fight has become boring. I sometimes hear my players say, I attack the guy who's taken the most damage. In essence, they've realized that there are no interesting decisions left to make. They've concluded that we've reached a point where it's just about trading blows until one side is left standing, and the optimal way to do that is by focusing down the bad guys one at a time. I don't begrudge them this, of course. Anytime we've reached that point in a fight, it's my failing, not theirs. Now, some of you are thinking there's absolutely a case in which deciding which monster to attack is an interesting decision, and of course, you're correct. Let's say that leading that trio of ogres is a hobgoblin war wizard, and he opens the fight by hasting one of the ogres. Now, the decision about which monster to attack has become an interesting one. Attacking the hobgoblin wizard is about potentially breaking his concentration. Attacking the ogre is about taking down this juggernaut before he just wreaks havoc upon my party. Interesting decisions, each with differing short-term narrative goals. Of course, my cat is the queen of making fights interesting. Her dominant strategy is jump up on the table and knock over all the minis, and things get really chaotic really quickly. But she's so cute. Look at this fluffy. Look at all that fluff. You're so fluffy. Can you show them your tummy? Show them your tummy? Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a good kitty tummy, huh? You love it. Oh, you love it. Oh, yeah. Okay, good job. goodbye. During the writing of this video, the patron saint of D&D YouTubers, Matt Colville, released his video on tactics and strategy, and so it felt only right to discuss his ideas and how they might fit into the context of this discussion we're having here. In his video, Matt essentially forwards two main ideas. The first is that we can classify kinds of encounters. Each type of encounter has its own monster makeup, and each has something different at stake. So a combat with a group of scouts isn't necessarily about fighting to the death. Rather, it's primarily about stopping that scout group from reporting back to its boss. Patrols work in a similar fashion, with the added element of a puzzle, because you could potentially just sneak past the patrols and avoid the encounter entirely if you're smart about it. In this classification, we can easily see this narrative goal framework that I'm trying to advance. Scout encounters are scout encounters because of the goal that they set for the party. Stop the scouts from reporting back. That's a flexible goal that can be achieved in many different ways, and that will provide your players with many interesting decisions to make. Ditto for the other types of encounters. The second idea Matt puts forth is to think about monsters in terms of roles or types, a device used heavily in 4th edition. The idea goes that monsters have different roles in a combat. You have artillery that might stand in the back and blast big damage into the battle. You have frontline guards that are there to prevent the players from easily addressing that artillery problem. You have brutes and glass cannons that wade into the fight and provide a very immediate and present danger that the party has to deal with. Building a fight with an eye toward varying your monster types provides your players with interesting decisions. Why? Because each of these types of monsters provides a little interstitial narrative goal for your players to work toward, while in the context of this overarching goal of the combat, whether that's to simply survive or win the fight or whatever other larger goal might exist. The fighter attacking the guards is an interesting decision, not only because it's a decision to go on the offensive, but because it's a decision to break down that barrier. The wizard in the party choosing to cast Fireball on that artillery in the back isn't interesting because the wizard had an option of whom to cast Fireball on. It's interesting because choosing to cast it on the artillery in the back, as opposed to the guards up front, accomplishes a different narrative goal. Alright, I think I've talked enough about goals in combat. I was really hoping to wrap up this interesting combat video in a single video, but it's taken longer than I thought. My light has essentially gone away. So it's time for me to wrap this up. I will do the second part of Interesting Combat in the next video. I want to talk about how to either encourage or force your players to constantly be making little decisions in the context of a fight, and we're going to do it with two very concrete examples from a dungeon that I ran recently with my normal Thursday night group. So next time, part 2 of how to keep fights interesting. See you then.